pesky clocks mess everything up. Everybody's enjoying themselves so much. You're supposed to have fun in church and enjoy yourself, are you? What's going on?
We're supposed to be.
Not supposed to do that. Be serious. I guess with being Labor Day, we're going to have a smaller group today. Well, good morning. Guess we got to do more than that to break up this fellowship, don't we? Yeah. Again, what an awful thing. Enjoying ourselves, having fun in church. What a terrible thing that is, huh? Well, welcome. We suspect we're going to have a smaller group today. That last traveling weekend for some of the break, but that's okay. As you remember, last week we were looking over some challenging topics that we've certainly been confronted with and dealing with in more recent times. And of course, some of those topics, of course, go way back. And we last week we were looking at so much of the racial tensions that were reignited in the last 10 years or so. Whereas others thought, oh, we've made progress and we've done this, and then of course there was others that didn't certainly think that, and others that said, yeah, there's progress, but a lot more to go, and so on and so forth. And again, the purpose of these things and looking at them is to realize this environment that we're in, the culture, the world, the events that we're dealing with and having to function in as Christians. And how we're able to do that, and that starts with certainly having a greater awareness of what's going on, because as we know, we all don't always perceive all things. We're not always aware of things. Others are, others aren't. They affect some, they don't affect others, and it's always been that way. As Joe Longer pointed out at that time, we had no idea any of this was going on in our little neck of the woods, and so on, and that's a true thing, but that doesn't mean it's not going on in the other necks of the woods, so to speak. And so as we look through this, it's important that we strive to have an idea on these things. And so as we were looking at, we've seen that in our fellowship, and I'm assuming others, that these uncomfortable topics by some are dealt with head on, and others, like I shared, how my mom was, she just wanted to change the subject and not deal with it, and we all understand that. We've all been there. Sometimes we can, sometimes you can only handle so much, and so nonetheless, often that was done. That might not mean that people that were doing that had all this animosity in their hearts or things like this, but it's just how does one deal with these? And so as we were ending last time, we had mentioned previously that Greg Tidwell, who had been part of some of the publications, Gospel Advocate, the editor. And in the last few years of the Gospel Advocate, the editorship kind of changed, as we had said, to this more conservative end of things. And but anyhow, he had gone around and he had written up these 10 trends that we'd mentioned, and we had looked at them to some degree. And again, the thing that's important is that you know, while there's some acknowledging of things, there's also just not really sure what to do about them. And Gospel Advocate editor Greg Tidwell's 10 Trends Affecting Churches of Christ in the 21st Century did not include concerns about racial justice or civil rights in American culture. Tidwell did express opposition to the social gospel, and we talked before how there's a long history of that. And of course, what was the social gospel? The social gospel was started in the 19th century and into the 20th and was very influential, and that was the idea that we're changing, that we need to affect these, you know, the governments and the things like that, and to Christianize the culture so there's better decisions made and so on and so forth. And so there was those that focused so much on that and almost equating that, which what the gospel was a complaint against that. And to some felt due to the ignoring of these more spiritual connections and complaints. And so he did acknowledge as part of his third trend, demographic shifts, the existence of ethnic divisions among churches of Christ, and that the nation was very conflicted over ethnicity. So while there may be an acknowledgement, there often was not, you know, unsure what to do about it. Tidwell's device about this division: we need to be very careful we do not permit ourselves to be pulled in the political conflict, and we must make sure that we do not have racial insensitive contempt for those who differ from us in terms of race or ethnicity, because God shows no partiality. And he's looking at Acts chapter 10 for that. Tidwell had much to say about, as we talked about, kind of the Christianized view of America, but not a whole lot about the specifics of the civil rights. And you know what? A lot of us can probably relate to what, you know, to that position. I know I personally, you know, remember looking at and thinking along those lines. If I don't have any animosity, why should anybody else have animosity? And that's not a horrible or terrible thing or position, but usually it takes more. And so again, these are these challenges, just pointing out the difficulties. But not all traditionalists were silent. Eric Lyon had 5 reasons racism is ridiculous, was presented to the World Video Bible School and Apologetics Press, and argued that racism was sinful. Lyon cited Acts 17:26, from one man he made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their land. And among many other passages, to make his case that all people were created equally in God's images and related through Adam and Eve, therefore racism is ridiculous. And of course, there's some soundness to that understanding. Several years ago, a couple years ago at Florissant, they had a special conference, presentation, whatever, that some of us went to. And it was from, a lot of it was based on some things from Ken Ham. He's the one that built the Ark in Ohio, and others. And he looks to Genesis for lots of things. But one of the bases of that conference was that, you know, really, as you look biologically and scientifically, the only difference between people is, you know, how much melatonin you have. You know, a little more of this and, you know, less of that or whatever, and that's really the differences. And of course, that would certainly be borne out in this, certainly in this passage in Acts. And so there were those that, you know, were acknowledging these things, and I think that we would, you know, not disagree with that. Yes, Bill.
I think all of us believe this and understand this, but I'll just restate it and emphasize it today that Acts, the verses you just had up there, and yes, going back to Genesis and the creation, one Adam was created, and then distributed.
Yeah.
But who would interfere with that as he did with the Garden of Eden and the fruit from the tree? think of other than the evil one. So that is just another foothold that the evil one has on
Sure.
society.
And it's been
from.
long held.
Yeah.
You know, it's been, you can go back many, many centuries and longer, those designations. In a longer version of the same talk, in polishing the pulpit, as we said, is a gathering of those more conservative-minded, huge gathering, Lyons emphasized that it was not racist to say all lives matter. Now, as you recall, that's going back to a few years ago with, you know, more of the turmoil, and then we had the Black Lives Matter. And so the concern was by those that were using that statement, was that look at these things that are happening, and that was so. But then there was others that would say all lives matter. And that's also true, you know, but there were some that they felt, wait a minute, you're taking away by saying that from the importance of these issues we're trying to point out here with what's happening to, as you view black people and the different stuff that was going on. And so that was what was kind of behind some of that. But he also is acceptable to say a certain group of people matter. If those people are being mistreated, Lyons said Christians should be colorblind and never be racist. However, he placed the blame of racism on atheists and evolutionists rather than owning to Christianity's central role in the creation of some of this. And there, in the selected bibliography of long ago, I don't even know if you still have those papers, there was one book that I said Lee had given me called basically the pro-slavery Christianity in the antebellum South, you know, before the Civil War, and it was extensive. I think I gave it to Carl, and Carl read it for a while, and then returned that. And so just documenting just so much. And so, you know, there was. That doesn't mean everybody thought that way, but there was a strong view from some in that. And so many still felt that even the colorblind language was still inadequate and often delegitimized the daily experiences of many people of color. Further, many white and some black traditionalists did not see social justice related to the gospel. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so what does that mean? Well, we've also said that among many of our black brethren, that many of them tend to look more like the old Church of Christ way of looking at things, the old traditionalist way, the old exclusivist, more those aspects. They tend to hold on to more of that. And so that's what that's kind of referring to. And so because of that, there were those that did not embrace social gospel, though there were many that did, and we've kind of documented that was going on in the 60s. You know, there was those that were following the one brother, Bowser, who wanted nothing to do with all of that and kind of went their separate ways. And then you had Marshall Keeble, who was willing to put up with indulgences or these indignities, I should say, so that he got funding to go and keep preaching the gospel. And it was two different approaches, and we went over that quite a bit. So that's what that's referring to. So there was not, if nothing else, I hope over this time we realized that there's not one way, there's a big spectrum within every facet of where people are at. And so if we have the narrative that it's just this, and it's only this, and everybody thinks that, it's just not accurate. And so just a reminder of that. Now, in the 21st century, issues revolving around race and social justice continue just as politicized as they've been in the 60s. Of more recent times, we've been confronted with critical race theory, CR2. This is stuff that we've kind of been much more aware of in the last 10 or 15 years. Critical race theory. Well, what is it? Let's look at it, because when we've looked at our evening news and we've heard everything's racist and this and that, and that there's everybody's a victim, and it's because of this white, male, Christian dominated culture and all these things. And so, when you're sitting there listening to news and you hear the news folks talking like this, we go, what is going on? Well, that's the influences of what this is, and so it's important that we have an understanding, and our understanding from this is going to be about that. Okay, but just to give us an idea. Critical race theory is an intellectual social movement. In other words, it kind of started in academia. Okay? And it is loosely organized framework of legal analysis. In other words, way they're looking at things, based on the premise that race is not a natural, biological, grounded feature. In other words, we're all people. And so this division of, all this, of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but is socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and to exploit people of color. Okay, there's a whole lot in this behind what, and I'll try to explain it a little bit. And that is this idea that you have those that are dominant and those that are oppressed. And so you have the powerful and you have those that aren't the powerful. That's the lens that's being looked through. And this has a lot of origins in the thinking of Karl Marx, his dividing up everybody into these social groups and interests and things like that. And like anything, it's not that there's not some substance or foundation to some of this way of thinking. Okay? I say some. Okay? And so, what is a social construct? The thing is society has made this and determined this. This is not a natural thing, but it's something that society has imposed. And so those that have the power imposed views and ways of doing things, and therefore it's the powerful that control things, that write history, that whatever you want to insert. That's kind of the thinking that's going on here. That it shouldn't be this way, but this is what it is. So that's the premise behind that. Now, when you have that, as much evidence as there may be for some things that support some of that, a lot of times it grows, and then it becomes any and everything. You see it everywhere in everything. And so sometimes that, like, wait a minute, isn't that going a little, well, we as human beings have a tendency to do that. Bill, were you going to say something?
You mentioned Karl Marx. There's others, but how about Adolf Hitler? You're talking about the growing, unbelievable. That wasn't a color factor. It was a race, a pure race color, pure race radicalism.
Sure. Yeah, and so however variants or whatever directions one takes it, and of course, those that are old enough to have known or experienced or whatever, we realize that when places went full Karl Marx, things weren't good. And the millions and millions and millions have died in Russia, China. All that, why? Trying to enforce that everybody be equal. And, and all the problems with all this. Okay, and so, but anyhow, but this is somewhat what's the basis of some of this thinking. Critical race theorists hold that racism is inherent, this way of looking at things, this idea that there are those that are superior, and for at least Western discussion, that's where you hear the white superiority, and that focused and blamed on everything, is inherent in law and legal institutions. So when they say that inherent racism and all that we've heard, that's kind of what they're talking about in the way they're looking at it. And the legal institutions, in other words, it's grounded in law. Well, you could find examples of what was Jim Crow. That was examples of these things grounded in law. And so it's not that there weren't examples. Insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. Critical race theorists are generally dedicated to applying their understanding to the institutional or structural nature of racism to the concrete, if distant, goal of eliminating it. In other words, they're seeing it enshrined, if you will, or codified in so many of these things as they're looking at it. And it's not that there's not some substance in some of that at times, but that's how they're looking at it. You got the dominant group, in this case white people, they've had it so they could have it the way they wanted it, and so it's made it difficult. And again, there's evidence for those things as we've looked at. Bill.
Carl, had something.
Oh, I'm sorry, Carl, I didn't see your hand.
It was a grunt.
Oh, so critical race theory, in this formal sense, in this really organized way, was officially, and again, what's official, where they look to some point, in this case, kind of a conference, in 1989. And so while the roots of this thinking have been around for quite a while, it kind of all started coming together and becoming real significant. And again, this is in academia. And so it often takes time for things to trickle down from academia down to the rest of us. And that's not all bad, but that's often how it works. At the first annual workshop of critical race theory, through its intellectual origins, go back much further to the 60s and 70s, even before that, its immediate precursor, so again, remember, what's the origins of things? Well, there's influences that are even earlier, and we've documented that about our own fellowship in ways of thinking and so on, going back to the Middle Ages, was the critical legal studies movement, which dedicated itself to examining how the law and legal institutions serve the interests of the wealthy and the powerful at the expense of the poor and the marginalized. Now, this is a tenet directly how Marx thought. I'm not trying to say that just because he thought it means it has no validity because of all that came afterwards, but this is an observation. And so they're looking at it through this lens of the powerful, and thus you get, you hear terms like oppressed, dominant, those kind of things fit into that language. I remember when I was still teaching, we took a survey in a faculty meeting, and I didn't know what this stuff was. I don't know that any of us knew what this stuff was. And so I'm taking this survey, and it's like, if I'm white, male, and a Christian, I'm this, and that. And I was just furious about that, because I wasn't that way. And so you see all the stereotyping and the categorizing that often they, and rightly so, throw a fit about it.
Under the guise of academia.
Well, but then it's like, so it's not okay there, but it's okay here? And again, you know, sometimes these are difficult things, but nonetheless, critical legal studies is an offshoot of Marxist-oriented critical theory, as I said, and they may be viewed as a radicalization, in other words, taking it and running with it, of early 20th century legal realism. Now, these are all things that we're not familiar with at all, but just trying to get a little grounding on some of this. A school of legal philosophy according to which judicial decision-making, in other words, now we're talking in the court system, we're talking in the laws, that judicial decision-making, especially at the appellate level, is influenced by much non-legal, political, or ideological factors, as by precedent, principles, or legal reasoning. Now, and so they're saying there's a whole bunch of other factors other than what the law just says is influencing these decisions. Now, it's kind of ironic, at least as I look at it, as we see decisions that are made and we listen to on the news, that there are those that would be supportive of this very much so, and yet they're using other things to come up with their decisions and following law. And, you know, that's often how that stuff goes when you get really intense on stuff. In other words, you know, rules for thee and not for me. And it works both ways. Okay, but nonetheless. And so if your head's spinning, of course it is. This stuff can be really confusing. But this is the thinking that is behind a lot of what we've seen in what they're talking about with the schools and the school board races, and saying that this stuff is, you know, we've heard about it with Francis Howell and with others and things over the last few years and others. Well, this is what that's somewhat about. And so if it's confusing, yeah, it is, but here's kind of the basis behind this. Bill?
Profiling is hard to eliminate, but
sure.
Profiling is what it is in a modern term. And it's something I do myself.
Sure.
I see somebody in the street across the street, and they're walking in front of my friend's apartment and stops and looks around. All of a sudden, I start profiling.
It was like when I came over to your place.
Yeah.
Somebody came out and said, "Who are you?" To me.
That's right.
And I was coming over to your place. You know, sure. You know, and again, we're not getting a debate about, you know, all of that or the rightness or not of those things, but nonetheless.
The training has shifted on that. They're putting a lot of training into don't racially profile because you will miss things. Because all races can cause problems.
Yeah.
But they are still educating on profiling criminal behavior.
Yeah.
So just because you're not profiling racially, you still see things that are out of place for an environment. And you do want to pick up on those things and think, wow, that's not quite right. And so you don't want to overlook those. And so that's some of the way they train you, like profiling in itself. You know, if there's an active shooter and they say he's a 6-foot-tall man, don't stop everyone you pass just because you don't want to profile. You are looking for a specific profile.
Yeah.
But if you do it racially, you may miss other indicators
Sure.
because you're looking at the wrong thing.
And
You do have a shooter, and he does happen to be a particular race.
Yes.
That's helpful.
Yeah, it's helpful. So,
sure.
but when you're just looking like, if you haven't identified the person you have to train now, is don't get so focused on that. Like after 9/11, they were really pushing, don't get so focused on the race because there are other terrorists you might miss.
This kind of happened to me this week. There was a guy in the neighborhood walking in front of a house, kind of taking pictures, writing down things on a list piece of paper. I kind of feel good about your comments because it just so happened the guy happened to be black. But that was not what I was looking at. I was
Gotta
looking
get
at the fact that here's a
away
guy
from it.
that's it's unusual. There's not a truck with a sign on it. What's up here?
So they're really teaching get away from profiling heuristics and but do profile activity.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, what we're seeing is this idea of profiling shouldn't be all thrown out because it's been abused in places or done incorrectly or whatever. And that just adds to the complexity of these things. Because if you've been at the end of that happening to you for what you would think is no good reasons, then you'd be much more sensitive to that. And so, again, that affects the lens and how you're looking through it and so on and so on. So it makes it difficult. But anyhow, thanks for that, Daniel, for that insight there. And so, while many CLS scholars, like many CLS, critical race theorists believed that political liberalism was incapable of adequately addressing fundamental problems of injustice in American society, notwithstanding legislation and court rulings advancing civil rights in the 50s and 60s, because its emphasis on the equitable treatment under the law of all races, colorblindness, rendered it capable of recognizing only the most overt, obvious racist practices, and not those that were relatively indirect, subtle, or systematic. Okay, what is that saying? All right, there were those thinkers. They're up there looking and examining this. Now, liberalism, for most of us, was there was a way of looking at things, and usually for a lot of us, it was looked at in a negative light. Liberalism was the problem with everything, and everything was labeled liberal that was different or further than we might go, and that could be on any topic, actually. And so it was certainly breaking out of what the status quo was. And so liberalism brought about a lot of, in other words, that instead of keeping it the way it was, they're saying we need to change from this that we saw in the 50s and the 60s, and so on and so forth. That was the product. Well, as we get up into these times, there are those that say, hey, that's not good enough. That's not enough. It needs to be more. And just like anything, there's always those that think more is better. More intense you are, the more hardcore you are. You know, just like you have, for example, like in Islam, you have those that are willing to fly the planes. Not all Muslims are willing to do the planes, and to do probably huge quantities or not.
However,
okay, that isn't where they're at. Yes. However,
if you come to this country
yeah,
and you live by the American Constitution,
yeah,
then you're under that law,
yeah,
if you will, not Sharia
yeah.
or not anything else out there. You may cater to that in your own personal life,
Yeah.
but it better not be imposed, because we already have a law of the land.
Well, correct, but that's a
Some
different.
of us live by
That's a different
better,
subject, though.
better issue.
But that's a different subject what you're talking about.
And I am sorry.
But that's okay. And so they're saying it isn't enough. And so they're looking even deeper into things. And so one of the things that's happened in critical race theory is they have tried to look in to see who are these disadvantaged groups. And so it expanded and became huge and became almost anything that you could find something for. And that's why the other day on the news they had someone speaking at some convention up in Minnesota. And this lady identified herself as an indigenous, queer, maybe you all saw that. In other words, she was putting forth a label, a list of things that she was. That's coming from this. And the idea is that you're an oppressed group. And so the way this thinking evolved is it almost seemed that if you could find the most categories you were in, that made you the most oppressed and therefore the most in need. And so I'm a this, this, and this. Well, I'm a this, 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 and this, and that. you know, and however, and that's kind of trying to joke around a little bit about a serious topic, but nonetheless. And so then you see even further subdivisions within those categories. And some would say, where does it end? Where, you know, it's like, do we get down to the atom when we're breaking things down? How far do you go? And so there were those, and many that are marching in protests, and that doesn't mean all, but those grievances are, look, I'm a victim of these 5, 6, 7, 8 different things because I'm a this, that, or this or that, or whatever. And so that's how this develops. And so this is what's being dealt with out here. There are those that think that way. And even though there may be those that are very much deeply embedded in that, that trickles out to varying degrees, lesser, however, in other things. And so trying to understand what this is. And so, you know, sometimes the old phrase is you're finding something that's not there. You're looking for something that's not there. It might apply in some of this. I'm not saying all of it, not trying to dismiss, but nonetheless. Liberalism was also faulted for mistakenly presupposing the apolitical nature of judicial decision making. In other words, well, justice is supposed to be blind, and so that's what that's referring to. And for taking a self-consciously incremental reformist approach that reformed unjust social arrangements and afforded opportunities for retrenchment and blacksliding through administration. So what's this saying? Saying, you know what? So they're being critical of those that were traditional liberals, and they're saying that you're putting way too much trust in this political process. It's influenced by all these other things, and your reformist or incremental approach, that just isn't going to work. It needs to be big. It needs to happen and not trickle down, if you will, to use a phrase that was used in economics decades ago. And so that's what this is talking about. Unlike most CLS scholars, however, critical race theorists did not wish to abandon the notions of law and legal rights altogether, because in their experience, some laws and legal reforms had done much to help people. And so again, it's not clear cut. It's all over the place.
CLS one more time. I missed it.
Critical legal scholars is what was the precursor to what we call the critical race theory that we've seen.
Critical legal scholars are Christian.
Do what?
I wonder how many of those critical legal scholars are Christian.
Good question. I would say there's probably some, and because as we've already said, there's your Christian, there's Christians, there's Christian right, there's Christian left. There's those that believe that very much trying to right these things by whatever means is what Jesus would do. And there is others that would say the exact opposite, that is what Jesus would do. And they're claiming both to look at the same. I'm just telling you. Now, we might disagree or not, however, on all this, but nonetheless, that's how some. But however, that doesn't mean all are Christians that are looking at this. Now, as we've discussed this, we've been talking about this broad societal look at it, rather than saying how many people of our fellowship were involved in it. That wasn't the purpose of it. Because these things have affected us all. And it's what's out there. And so as we're out there trying to share the gospel or connect with people and so on, this is what many, especially of the younger folks, think a lot this way. This has been influential to them and their way of looking. CRT has created much division in this country on many different levels, its critiques condemn it, or its critics condemn it for its foundations in teaching of Karl Marx that divide people into classes and traits, a point that its supporters do not deny. They would say, well, yeah, because that's the way it is. Supporters tend to lampoon critics and dismiss their concerns. So there we go to kind of this other premise, generally, as we've looked at over the whole course of our study, that if it isn't like I think, I quickly dismiss. And we shouldn't do that. We should try to understand. Doesn't mean we agree, doesn't mean we support, but we should at least try to understand. Because a lot of things aren't as crazy once we understand them, and some things will always be crazy. Okay? It's not just once you understand a little bit. Supporters tend to lampoon, as we said. As a result, the concerns of those who subscribe or oppose are not listened to by either side. And so there we have the issue. There we continue to have the clashes. Nobody's listening to anybody. Everybody's already dismissed and things like that. And you know, and that's why it's such a difficult time, certainly that we're in, because we're in the middle of a lot of this that you see on the news and all this that we're dealing with. Okay? Now, what are some things that have been done trying to bring together? Well, despite these divides and challenges, significant efforts for racial justice and unity existed among churches of Christ, as other fellowships. Some institutions apologized for past racism and discrimination. Pepperdine University had a rededication ceremony of the portrait featuring Larry Kimmons, the 15-year-old who was shot and killed by a Pepperdine security guard in 1969. So again, they have one that's honoring something where something bad happened. And I think we talked about this at the time we were looking at it, but I don't know if we covered him. Pepperdine had a rededication ceremony in the late 1990s, before Lipscomb's apology in 2001, you know, for all the things that happened with the Institute, the black school that was there in Nashville. President of Abilene Christian University, Royce Money, under the mentorship of black leaders Andrew Harston, Tony Roach, Evan Seamster, organized the One in Christ Conference for black and white leaders in 1999. And so there's efforts at trying to get together and talk and to work on these things, because as we've documented, there is a big divide. Remember, the black congregations generally went their own way back at the end of the 60s and even before. Among the many fruits of that conference was an apology from Royce Money on behalf of ACU to the Black Churches of Christ. In 1999, in front of a packed assembly at Southwest Christian College, Money said, "We are here today to confess the sins of racism and discrimination and to issue a formal apology to all, to express regret and to ask for your forgiveness." Outgoing chairman of the board of directors of the Southwestern Christian College, Fred Gray, who is the lawyer we talked about quite a bit last week, on behalf of Southwest Christian, I generally accept and look forward to a long and fruitful relationship. Now, many of us probably had no idea that this happened, or maybe we heard something, a blurb about it, maybe in the Chronicle or something like that. Of course, look at that, it's 26 years ago. But that was very significant at the time, and then we documented the troubles in our institutions with this back when we were looking at that. Unfortunately, after more than one successful One in Christ conference in 2000, the significant doctrinal divides between Abilene and Southwestern Christian, along with the divergent misunderstandings of what those events were meant to accomplish, led to an abrupt end of that. In other words, they lasted a couple years and then they ceased meeting. And so what was that? It wasn't racial stuff as much as it was theological. Those divides existed not only between Abilene and Southwestern, but also within the African American churches in general. Black leaders and members continued to disagree on how central Social justice was to the gospel as the legacies of Bowser and Marshall Keeble persisted. We talked about that when we looked in the 60s quite a bit at that. Some felt they should go this way, others felt they should be more involved. But the African American churches also experienced internal discussion over issues rooted in the traditional legalism and patternism, that Enlightenment way of looking at things that we looked at a lot. Should congregations allow hand clapping, praise dancing, titles for preachers, etc.? A black ultra-conservative group started a new National Church of Christ lectureship in 2017 because of disagreements in those issues. So the black churches have had their own lectureships for quite a while, and we've gone to some of them before, and they move around. They've been to St. Louis before. We've given some to help support some of that. Okay, and because we talked about that division that happened long ago. Well, even within those, you got these issues on some of these topics, and probably others, because you know there's usually many things. And they formed their own lectureship because you're all not doing it right. Bill.
I have a different theory concerning, now, these list of things are valid and good reasons for a separation, probably, the people that we feel them. But I think the 2002 thing would cost more in light of the fact that the black churches of Christ would see and feel a racial prejudice on a national scope if something happens. They would put their jaws to it like a snapping turtle and not turn loose. And they would try to enlighten the world as to how much is wrong with this. Whereas those on the other side, I would just say the white Church of Christ, I don't know how to classify that, would keep silent. They wouldn't participate in the discussion. They would have a tendency to ignore this racial prejudice act that had taken place.
Well, but these issues, it was forming this second new lectureship among the black congregations was not racial stuff. It was these other topics.
Yeah, and I'm disagreeing. So there.
Among the black churches? Well,
Yeah.
these were, in other words, just like among the white church, if you will, you had these things divided, so it was also happening.
Now, these things divide all churches.
Well, they can
They
and have.
right here in St. Charles County.
And some would say, should they, is a whole different question.
Yeah.
Okay, right?
Yeah, I should-
Have, but should they? And so we're way over. So we will continue on next time. Thank you very much.